Well, thank you everybody. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. I'd like to thank Mr. Ray Finch and the FIMSO program for making this possible to begin with. And for this semester, I focused my research on Russian economic diversification through foreign direct investment. And so I began this research by taking a look at Russia's economy, and I think all of you know that they're very reliant on their energy exports for a lot of their revenues. And I've also noticed that some of the prices of oil and energy have been dropping, which has been partially because of the world economic downturn, which has been slowly rebounding, but also because of the copious amounts of shale gas and oil that we've been able to find right here in North America. And so I noticed this, and so, is there a elixir? Yeah. And so, for example, if you look here, you'll see this is Russia's growth with the price of oil, and then around 2008, 2009, where the price of oil declined, so did Russia's economy. And so you also see that obviously Russia's been growing over the past few years, and it's been growing enough to become one of the major emerging countries in the world, but that has also been a consequence of its heavy oil exports. And so, but if you look at the rest of their economy, there's not much to it really. They're mostly shipping out oil, like I said. They have a little bit of metal industry, some chemicals and light machinery, but other than the oil, that's pretty much what has been driving the bus. And so they have expected the price of Brent crude, which is the measure that's used by the European markets, to remain at $120 a barrel. It's currently at $100 a barrel, and it's expected to fall further. So obviously this leaves them with a major gap in their budget, which will inevitably hurt them in the future. So I took a look at, well, how can they change this? How can they redevelop their economy, and what can they do to move away from what they've been relying on, which is just the export of natural goods. And so I was looking at their economy, and as a whole, for example, their manufacturing sector or their steel sector is incredibly inefficient compared to ours. For example, the amount of time that it takes, what an American steelworker will do in 40 hours, a Russian steelworker will do in around 200 hours. And that's partially because they just don't have the same technologies that we have and the same resources that we have. And so one way to change that is through inviting foreign investment, which will provide, with the transfer of technology, with improved competitiveness and certainly more effective management. And then I began investigating, well, why are people not coming to Russia? Which I'm sure most of you who are pretty knowledgeable in Russia have some idea. It's just not a very attractive place to invest for a foreigner. This is the Heritage Foundation 2013 Index of Economic Freedom. This incorporates stuff, or certain numbers such as the availability of loans, the amount of corruption that's in the country, things of that nature. And so Russia is in the repressed section, which is obviously not something that a country that needs foreign investment would want to be at. But there have been examples of foreign direct investment coming into the country and being efficient and productive. For example, AutoVAZ. Last semester I gave a talk on Russia's auto industry, and one of their main, or I suppose their main automaker, AutoVAZ, was suffering from tremendous amounts of inefficiency and pretty much corporate waste throughout. But their owner, Oleg, guess?
Very possible.
Yeah, that's right. he finally decided that he needed some different leadership. And so, for example, he hired former GM executive Bo Anderson, who's of Swedish descent, to help become the GM of the company and revitalize them. And with this new management, they've been able to double their output while cutting their workforce in half, which obviously means more profits for them, and it means that their manufacturing is more efficient. And so we can see here, this is how they've been able to grow once they've been able to use foreign expertise in their manufacturing. And so these are the sorts of processes that they can implement throughout their economy, not only in the automotive sector, but for example, their railroads are widely inefficient. Their infrastructure is in disrepair in much of the country. Certainly in Moscow it's better than in other places, but once you go to the more rural parts of Russia, sometimes the road conditions are not very good, certainly. And so they can use this foreign expertise and knowledge to bring in this new technology and new management in order to revitalize these flailing industries. And so they've undertaken certain reforms to try to attract foreign investment. For example, they've tried to strengthen their IP protections. The Russian judiciary system has not always been the most effective place for foreign investors to go to try to vindicate their rights. But they've established a new court specifically for IP, supposedly with the aim of providing judges who have an understanding in this particular subject and who will apply the laws uniformly. And this will in turn strengthen investor confidence and make them more likely to invest their capital into the country, as well as their expertise and their time. Obviously, I'm sure that all of you are aware that corruption, as I mentioned earlier, is a tremendous issue in Russia, and it causes around $200 billion in lost earnings over the course of every year. So this is money that they could be making that's instead being wasted. And so, for example, they've tried to enact certain reforms that require officials to report where they're spending their money and where that money came from. Of course, privatization is another thing that they're striving for. The Russian economy is very state-owned, and Putin has implemented a 5-year plan to sell off some of these large state-owned companies, or partially state-owned companies, not fully state-owned. Well, so obviously, I guess that begs the question, will any of this matter? Because certainly they can say that they're going to do all of these things, and that they're going to implement these reforms, and that they're going to try to change what has been their system for many years at this point. But will that do anything? And so I found this quote from Vladimir Putin speaking at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, and he says that we are well aware of the serious long-term and medium-term challenges for our economy. The economy is still not properly diversified. Much of the added value is created in the commodity sector. There's a high proportion of non-competitive old plants, and the level of Russian dependence on oil prices remains very high. So, again, this is nothing new necessarily, but there are certainly many people out there who feel that the reduction in oil prices will inevitably cause Russia's economy to fail and to fall into somewhat of a state of disarray. But I suppose that my main point from this research is that Russia understands that they need these changes. And, for example, Putin understands that he needs these changes, and that if the economy falls apart on his watch, his whole legacy, so to speak, of building up Russia from what it was in the 90s, which was certainly quite a wild time, to a more stable social environment that it is today. Certainly it's not perfect by any means, but it's certainly been better. But
if they lose this power, if they lose their economic power, then they will inevitably lose their position on the world stage as being someone who has an influence. And certainly the current President Putin will no longer have the same stature, internationally certainly, and eventually domestically, because once they lose this economic, or the growth that they've been seeing, the people are going to eventually begin to become frustrated with this situation. And so currently their economic condition is unsustainable. And so, as I said, my main thesis from this, from the paper that I wrote, was that contrary to popular belief, Russia can revitalize their economy, and they can strengthen their economy, and they can do this through attracting foreign direct investment. And the reason that they will be able to attract this foreign direct investment is because they realize a need for it. They realize that without it, their growth will be unsustainable. And so this is why my research has come to the conclusion that Russia will eventually diversify their economy through foreign direct investment. Certainly the question remains, how long will that take? How bad does it have to get for it to get to this point? And what will be some of the major reforms that will push these sorts of changes forward? Just last week, Russia reported, I think I had that as my first slide. Russia reported their 5th consecutive quarter of reduced GDP growth. And they've also had to begin to dig into their reserves, which is sort of their rainy day fund, to try to sustain some of their government spending. And so it's already begun to impact them. And so I think within the coming years, there are certain to be changes throughout the Russian system. And if anybody's interested in reading my paper, I am more than happy to share it with you. And so I'd like to thank Mr. Finch for providing me with some guidance and actually meeting with me over the March break. I'd like to thank the FIMSO organization, as I did beforehand. I'd like to thank Professor Melishova for helping me out with this in the beginning. And I'd like to thank you very much. We had some conversations and you helped me structure my paper. And I'd like to thank all of you in attendance today. Thank you for coming out, and I hope you learned something. And please feel free to ask me any questions you may have.